Okay, so the goal of this first video is going to be to get this far, to generate basically almost like a leotard for our character, including the hands, the arms, the neck, the entire torso, down to the legs, right? And in the next video, we'll start to create the face. So I'll show you how to do this in not a lot of time. And really the most important thing to remember here is that we want to define big pathways first. That's what's going to make this entire process more accurate and faster, right? So by defining the big pathway, the fingers flow into the top of the hand. The top of the hand in our case flows into the top of the lower part of the arm. The top of the lower part of the arm flows into the top of the upper part of the arm. And then we're going to do the same thing here for the front of the arm. And then we have a couple of options. I can take the front of the arm and run it across the chest, and the back of the arm and run it across the back. So I can do that and that, right? And the big idea here is that by defining the pathways first, you're determining later on when you add more geometry to these areas, where the flow of that geometry is going to go, right? So that part is really an important concept to understand for making this go faster. So while initially this looks really sort of unappealing and not complete, it is, I promise you, a good investment to sort of work this way if you're not that familiar with retopology. So here, for example, I can go ahead and start to build out the entire pathway for all of the head and neck and arms, etc. And I'm going to pause this for a second to go help my wife with the groceries, and I'll be right back. Alright, back at it. So now let's do this. And so now we've got the basic pathways down for everything, right? And again, this doesn't look amazing, right? But I find this to be a very, very fast way to work. So I'm going to insert an edge loop here, excuse me, and here. And I'm going to connect these two edges. And these two edges, sometimes it's hard to get the right angle to let Quad Draw attach them, so I'll just go over to Bridge between those two edges, and I'll go to Quad Draw here and do that and that. And I'm going to leave a hole in the hand where the thumb is there, just like there's a hole where the fingers are. And before I do anything else, what I want to do is make sure that the area excuse me, the area that the top plane defines is going all the way up and doing exactly what I wanted to do, all the way up into the neck, and the area that defines the bottom plane is doing the same, going down into the body, and the back plane is going across the back, and the front plane is going across the front here. That's all as I want it. Now if I decided, you know what, when I add more edges to, you know, say the top of the hand to make edges for the fingers, going all the way up here, if I didn't want that to travel up here to the side of the neck, if I wanted it to go, let's say, around the back here, well then I could just delete some faces and then rerun new edges that go in the direction that I want. So this is just a good planning phase. The way that I think about this is it's just like if you have a road, the road goes uphill, downhill, you know, around corners, whatever, and the lines that get painted on the road, they just follow whatever the road does. So as we start adding edges here, like I'm adding one for each finger loop, they're just going to follow what the road does, but we've defined what the road is, right? So now I'm going to go ahead and take these edges, and I'm just going to add one segment per finger. And sometimes it can be hard to get the finger to line up exactly with the right segment, so if you build that closer and then sort of drag it out, you get a little closer. And now on the bottom I'm going to do the same thing. So again, where people get into trouble with retopo and where they spend a lot of unnecessary time is really getting into the weeds and trying to follow the exact shape right away. There's a lot of mechanisms for making this model more heavily subdivided and sucking those subdivisions onto the mesh really easily. So now if I look, we've got that, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go over, I have my my target model on a layer, and I'm going to double click these edge loops like that, and I'm going to deselect the two edges here. So now I have only the top and bottom edges selected for this whole thing, and I'm going to come over and I'm going to say, hey, can I bridge those together? And it'll bridge the whole thing like that, right? And now I'm going to do the same thing for the thumb. So I'm going to go over and show that layer again. And with the thumb, I'm going to say, hey, the top plane of the thumb is here, and I want the top plane to go over across like this, and the bottom plane I want to go through the palm like this. So I can just sort of connect those, so shift and shift like that. But then I want these edges, so I'll come back over here and hide this, double click this edge loop, delete or control to deselect that edge, and then just go back over here and hit bridge again, and now it bridged between those edges, right? So the important thing here is I've got now an edge loop for each finger, right? And they're really chunky and they look bad, and we'll fix that. And then what I can do now is I can start to add subdivisions going up the length of the arm here. And if I turn on that layer again, what we'll see is, Quad Draw will allow us, when we add those subdivisions, to basically suck them directly onto the model, so we get something that's a little closer. And now, if we look at the flow of edges, because we find the flow first, the side planes of all of the fingers go all the way through, even in the thumb, so that they all fit the same. So I can go like, hey, let's add one or two edges here for the sides, and those go across the chest and across the back. And then I can come up here and say, well, let's add some subdivisions to the chest, and let's even add a couple of subdivisions to the waist. And you might say, okay, cool, that's all well and good, but it sort of looks garbagey and uneven and not really well planned out. Well, one of the nice things is, because we have our edge flow set up, I'm going to hold B on the keyboard and make my soft selection really big, and then just hold shift while I'm in Quad Draw. And what that's going to allow me to do is basically average out all of the points, and that quickly we can get to the beginning of something really good in terms of the edge flow for all of these edges. My lovely wife just brought me a cup of coffee, so I'm going to pause this so I can take a sip. Alright, that's good coffee. So now I am going to, let's go over here and go to Quad Draw. I'm going to insert a couple of edges there. And depending on what you're going to do, later on we'll add more detail to this, right? We'll add detail to the back, so we have some edge loops for the scapula. We'll add detail to the front, so we have some edge loops for the bottom of the pecs and the ribs. But for now, this is the general edge flow that we're going to be utilizing for the rest of the character. Now, if I go here in the top of the hand and say, hey, let's add another row across the middle of the thumb, and let's add another row across the middle of each finger. what we'll start to notice is really quickly we get a lot of resolution going all the way up the hand, right? Now, depending on what kind of production you're working on, this may already be too much resolution, right? So in the case of something like sort of older games, this can be a really challenging thing with, you know, all this ability to add resolution with modern technology. In the final video in this series, we'll talk a bit about what constitutes good topology for different purposes. You know, for sort of an older game with a tight poly budget, you might want to go one way. For something that's going to get like offline rendering, like you know, film or a commercial or a cinematic for a game or something like that, you have different rules that you want to follow. Generally speaking, excuse me, the general edge flow rules are the same, but the density and how you sort of stop edges from flowing along the complete path of the model is going to change depending on what your target sort of result is, right? Like what you're making the model for. But for now, if we look, we can see I added all those edges going up and down the arm, and they carry a tremendous amount of weight here into the neck. We're going to introduce something here called kiting. And what kiting is it's intentionally cutting off some edges so that they don't flow all the way through the model. Now, in games, triangles are fine usually, right? Games have embraced triangles for a very long time because it helps keep the poly budget low. In film, triangles are still sort of a bit of a dirty word, right? So if I go here and grab these two edges and say edit mesh, collapse, right? Now I can double click this edge loop and this edge loop, which were created when I created those center edges. And if we look at where those edges flow, they flow all the way up here. And I can hit Control Delete. Now I have to hit Control Delete, not just Delete, because that will also get rid of the vertices that are associated with those edges. Another way to make a kite like this is if I'm in Quad Draw and I have Auto Weld turned on, I can again grab the center line from this finger and the center line from this finger, and I can say let's drag you to that point and you to that point. Auto Weld will assume that you want to merge those together. Again, double click the edges, and if Control Delete to get rid of them. And if I get rid of the middle edge here, so just grab that one and hit Control Delete as well, then now if I slide this edge, we can see this is actually a four-sided shape even though it looks like a triangle, right? And this is called kiting because it looks like a kite. And if I look at the way those center edges flow up into each other, I added those, and now they don't add anything else to the topology that we had originally. I can come down here into the palm and do the exact same thing. So again, the center edge here and the center edge here, I'll go into Quad Draw, take that center edge and that center edge, merge them together, and then take this center edge and this center edge and merge those together. Grab these two edges, 1, 2, 3, 4, Control Delete, and then grab these edges here, Control Delete, and it got rid of those extra faces, right? So now if we look, we don't have any of those extra polys going all the way up into the model, right? So depending on the kind of production you have, you may not care if those edges travel all the way up, but for certain kinds of productions, in particular certain kinds of older games, it's really going to matter a lot. Now, another big thing to think about topologically, and I'll probably, you know, sort of say this a bunch, you have to understand the animation style of the mesh that you're working in. So if you have something that's going to accept a lot of squash and stretch, it's really important that even if there's anatomical detail modeled in, it's really important that the meshes have very evenly subdivided quads, meaning each one of these little faces should be about the same down the length of something that's going to squash or stretch or twist or bend, because the more even of a grid you have, the more you can evenly distribute how much that twist or bend or squash happens, right? But if you have something that's got a lot of anatomical landmarks like this, you can actually start to build in things like, let's put a little bit more resolution in around the elbow. And in that resolution, let's go ahead and say, you know, the elbow mostly bends one way. So let's start to put a little bit of a pre-warping into a little bit of the topology so that the back of the elbow is a little more open and the inside of the elbow is a little more compressed, right? So you can start to set that up. And then when you hold shift to smooth out that area, you can see that you get something that looks like that. Now let's say I get to this and I go, oh man, you know what? I really don't like this edge flow. I really want the pecs to come up over the shoulder. I'm actually going to select a couple of rows of faces here and delete them. And one of the beautiful things about working this way is that now I can sort of say, okay, well, which way do I want the edge to flow? Let's say I wanted the pecs to come up and over like this and then around the back like that. And I'm going to turn on the visibility of my layer again so I can see exactly what I'm drawing, right? And I'm going to hit B to turn off soft selection. And now what I'm going to do is I don't really care to count all of these little edges. I don't want to do that. What I really care about is just sort of setting up the way that the edge flow is going to work. So if I do that, I know eventually I'm going to connect this to that. And then eventually back here, let's say we go to maybe that and that, like that, right? And then over here, I'm going to say, well, you know, I'm going to need an edge here, and an edge here, and an edge here. And now I've got an edge here, but then I have like a weird little triangle here. And there's a bunch of things I can do. I can add a kite, right? So I can go ahead and put one edge there and do that. And now I've got a kite where I've got a quad. And now the pecs flow into the shoulder a little bit more. But again, always thinking about edge flow first. If I'm thinking about edge flow first, the rest of this sort of will fall in line. So now when I look at this, I still need more subdivisions to sort of be able to attach the arm, right? So if I go in here and add one more subdivision like that, I can start working my way around. And what's important, if I do this, if I start working on both sides of this edge, then eventually I'll get to a point around here maybe where things don't line up. What I want to do instead is start working in a single direction and work my way around. So now I can start going around like this and sort of seeing like, okay, if I do that, and then now if I do this, I get an edge that runs up across like that. So maybe we can do that. And then maybe this edge is going to go into another loop down here like this. All right, and now let's try and line these up. And then when I get up here, I now have this row of faces here. I can start to move some of this like so, and then make this row of faces a little bit bigger, and that's going to be where whatever excess edges I need, so in this case 2 more rows, I'm just going to add them across here. I can do that because again, I'm putting edge flow first, not just worried about the tiny little details. And now here's a totally different, still valid solution for the topology in the shoulder and the chest that may or may not work depending on the deformation requirements for the project that I'm working on, better or worse, right? In here, one of the things that I can do is I can do stuff like this where I go and add a couple of edges here, and now I can sort of stack those edges to make the edge of the deltoid, right? The end of the shoulder muscle here. Right? And then shift just to smooth everything out again to try and make the deformation a little bit smoother when it goes to get rigged. So lots of ways to think about how to approach this stuff, right? Ultimately, this is not the shoulder configuration I chose. I chose something a little bit closer to what would be cinematic or animation friendly. This would be closer to endgame sort of friendly, right? So, you know, just lots of little things to think about. Oh, and then of course, we want to add edges for the knuckles. And again, I prefer to do things in a systematic way, right? So adding the individual loops for the major knuckle areas first, and then going through and adding segments inside of each loop. So one in the middle of each loop. You know, and again, they'll all suck onto the model when they get added. and then a couple more around each joint. Right, so I'll go in later on and add a couple more around each joint, but you can see, hopefully without having to do all of that, that this stuff sort of, you know, flows in a way that's conducive to me getting a lot of information. Now, when I set up the hand to go across or the thumb rather, to go across like this and have those faces go up and around, it means in that direction I can add resolution. That's within my poly budget, obviously, but I can add as much resolution as I want going this way because it's not carrying up the arm, right? So, excuse me, anytime you can compartmentalize how the flow of information happens, like what we did with the kiting here or the kiting down here, you should, right? Because stuff that doesn't need to be carried all the way around, you can probably do without. So now I'm going to go and make the bottom part of his little leotard here. And again, I'm not worried about matching up the number right away. All I care about is the edge flow. So I know I'm going to want through the crotch here an edge flow that comes up and around like that to make his butt crack. And then I'm going to take the outer edges here and just do something like this. Make a little waistband like a little pair of underwear. Now here, right, it's hard to get these to line up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit clear dots, and I'm going to hit tab on the keyboard and then left mouse, and that will allow me to extrude. And I can extrude out an edge. So that's another way to do that. Sorry, I hit the wrong key. So now I can extrude like so, and then extrude one more time like this, and then snap those points to the middle like that, right? And we can, if I middle mouse drag these right over like that, we get that. And now's where I can sort of say, okay, well, let's go to the front. And in the front view, these guys can line up with one edge loop here, right? Like that. And then I can line up this edge loop like that, insert an edge, like so. And then line up this edge and sort of pick. So I'll say, let's get this edge lined up, maybe right there, right? And then let's add two more edges. And I'm going to delete history because it's starting to get a little slow. So just edit, delete all by type history, and that should speed things up a little bit, hopefully. Yep. All right, and then in here, let's go 1, 2. Work our way around like that. And here I've worked myself into a bit of a corner because I can't add another edge there because it's going to go all the way up the center line of the body. So in this case, what I do is get rid of these faces, delete, go back to quad draw, add those edges there, and now these faces come up and they just connect here. Again, edge flow, separate from thinking about anything else. And now I can make my soft selection and start to smooth out these areas a bit. And let's add a couple of edges in here to capture the curvature of his buttocks, his crotch. And now we can start to put in a little pre-bend for the hips. And build in his little man leotard. All right, so really quickly, you know, that was about 25 minutes and we've got the entire upper body done. And you know, I'm doing this while talking to you guys. Excuse me. So the whole goal of this thing is to just try and get the whole thing done in a couple of hours, right? So where we're going to end up with this model is actually something like this in a couple of hours, right? And the other videos in this series will show you how to go from the beginning that I just started to add details for the head, and then add details for the legs and the body, and then finally how to add things like kites for the bottom of the pecs and kites for the back of the scapula, so we have a few extra edges to sort of slide around. There's all kinds of areas, depending on the type of deformation you want for your character, where you can add more information like that. But to get to a really nice organized mesh like this, I think total time for everything, it was like just shy of 2 hours. I'm very into the idea with technical nonsense like this of like, hey, I want to knock it out in a morning. So if I come in at 9 a.m., I want to be done by noon, right? So, you know, my impetus to make this series of videos was, one, to get on to, you know, Gumroad and ArtStation's selling platforms. But these videos are free, but I just want to see what the experience is like to upload stuff to there. And this was a particular thing the last time I taught a class where people had a real problem understanding the workflow. Everybody wanted to make work that was really pretty initially. And it's like, no, it's okay for it to be ugly but informative for a little while. And then it's very easy to add the prettiness later, right? So again, thank you to Nick Zuccarello, who provided this mesh in ZBrush, and I bastardized it and made it a decimated mesh that I could use to suck onto. I wanted to use a mesh that everyone had access to, right? So if you're using ZBrush, you already have the mesh that I'm using to start with, right? And again, to get to that, you just go over to Lightbox, go to the tool menu, and look for Nick Z Human Male, right? So in the first video, I sort of go through how I decimated that model, removed the genitalia, because most of the time in production you're not adding the genitalia, and decimated it to 90,000 polygons, but it's still very smooth, and exported that, right? So the video before this one shows you that process, right? So you know, thanks for taking a look, and hopefully this makes some sense. Feel free to reach out. If it doesn't, you know, feel free to leave a comment, or let me know if this is helpful or not. All right, so thank you very much, and see you in the next video, where we will tackle the face.